What happens when one of the most fearless comedians in the world sits face to face with one of television's most powerful moderators, and neither of them is willing to back down? The studio of The View looked calm on the surface that morning. Bright lights, a cheerful audience, cameras gliding smoothly across the set. Another typical daytime broadcast, or at least that's what everyone believed. But within minutes of Dave Chappelle sitting down across from Whoopi Goldberg, the atmosphere in the room would shift so dramatically that even the producers behind the cameras would realize something unusual was unfolding. Because this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was about to become a moment where nothing was held back. Before we jump into this explosive encounter, take 1 second to support the channel. If you enjoy dramatic stories about shocking celebrity moments, hit subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps bring more intense stories like this to life. Now back to the moment. The audience erupted into applause as Dave Chappelle walked onto the stage. His presence carried that familiar energy, relaxed but unpredictable. He waved casually, giving the crowd a quick nod before settling into the chair across the panel. Whoopi Goldberg watched him carefully. As the longtime moderator of the show, she had interviewed presidents, actors, activists, and comedians. Heated debates were nothing new to her. But Dave Chappelle was different. He wasn't just a comedian. He was someone who had built a career by saying the things most people were afraid to say out loud. And lately, those words had sparked serious controversy. Whoopi adjusted her glasses slightly as the applause faded. "Dave," she began calmly, "it's good to have you here." Dave smiled politely. "Good to be here, Whoopi." For a brief moment, everything felt normal. But then Whoopi continued. "You've been making a lot of headlines recently," she said. "Your stand-up specials have sparked a lot of debate. Some people call it brave comedy. Others say it crosses a line." The audience shifted slightly in their seats. Dave leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Well," he said with a small grin, "I've learned something about headlines." Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Dave paused just long enough to let the room grow quiet. They're usually written by people who weren't in the room when the joke was told. The audience laughed instantly. Whoopi smiled, but there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes. "That may be true," she replied, "but people still feel the impact of those words." Dave nodded slowly. "I understand that." One of the co-hosts leaned forward. "But Dave, critics say comedians have a responsibility. When millions of people listen to you, the jokes can affect real lives." Dave turned slightly toward the panel. "Comedy has always affected real lives," he said calmly. "But it used to make people think." A small wave of applause rippled through the audience. Whoopi rested her hands on the table. "And you don't think it still does?" Dave chuckled softly. "Oh, it definitely makes people think," he said. "Mostly about whether they're allowed to laugh anymore." The audience erupted. Some clapped loudly. Others looked uncertain. The tension in the room was beginning to build, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. Whoopi leaned forward slightly. "Dave," she said, her voice steady, "there are communities who feel hurt by some of your material." Dave's smile faded just a little. He looked around the studio audience before responding. "You know what's interesting?" he said. "What?" Whoopi asked. Dave leaned forward. "Everybody talks about protecting feelings," he said quietly. "But nobody talks about protecting comedy." A murmur spread across the audience. One of the co-hosts jumped in quickly. "But comedy shouldn't come at someone else's expense." Dave turned toward her with a thoughtful expression. "Every joke comes at someone's expense," he replied. "That's literally how humor works." The audience reacted with a mixture of laughter and surprised whispers. Whoopi tapped the table gently with her fingers. "But times change," she said. "Society evolves." Dave nodded. "That's true." He paused. "But sometimes society evolves into something very fragile." The room fell quiet. A few audience members clapped hesitantly. Others looked toward the panel, waiting for the response. Whoopi tilted her head slightly. "So you think people today are too sensitive?" Dave shrugged. "I think people today are very comfortable telling other people what they're allowed to say." The audience gasped. The tension had officially arrived. Even the camera operators seemed to move a little more carefully now, sensing that the conversation was no longer routine television. Whoopi looked directly at Dave. "You know," she said slowly, "a lot of people believe comedy should challenge power, not punch down." Dave met her gaze without hesitation. "And who decides which direction is down?" The audience fell silent. That question hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite something bigger. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but Dave continued. Because from where I'm sitting, he said calmly, it looks like everybody thinks they're the one being punched. A loud wave of reactions burst through the crowd. Some people clapped loudly. Others gasped again. The panel exchanged quick glances. What had started as a standard celebrity interview was quickly turning into something much more intense. Whoopi folded her hands together. Her voice remained calm, but there was a sharper edge now. Dave, she said, are you saying comedians shouldn't have limits? Dave smiled again. Oh, we have limits. He leaned forward slightly. But the audience used to decide those limits. The audience roared with applause. The energy in the studio was now electric. Even people watching from home could probably feel it through the screen. Whoopi looked at Dave for a long moment. Then she said something that immediately changed the direction of the conversation. Well, she said slowly, if we're going to talk about limits, maybe we should talk about the real-world consequences of some of those jokes. The audience quieted instantly. Dave's expression shifted. Not angry, not defensive, but focused. All right, he said calmly. You want to talk about consequences? He leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. The entire studio seemed to lean in with him, because everyone suddenly sensed something. The polite part of the interview was over, and what was about to happen next might be the moment people would talk about for years. For a moment, the studio felt unusually quiet. Not the comfortable silence of a daytime talk show, but the tense stillness that comes when everyone senses the conversation is about to cross into dangerous territory. Across the table on The View, Dave Chappelle leaned forward slightly, his fingers loosely folded together. The relaxed comedian who had walked onto the stage minutes earlier was still there, but now his eyes carried a sharper focus. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg held his gaze. All right, Whoopi said calmly, her voice steady but deliberate. Let's talk about consequences. The word itself seemed to hang in the air. The audience shifted in their seats. Dave nodded slowly. Sure, he said. Let's talk about them. One of the co-hosts leaned in, clearly eager to press the point further. Dave, she said, your recent comedy specials have sparked serious criticism. Some people say the jokes you make about certain communities contribute to real-world harm. Dave tilted his head slightly. Harm, he repeated quietly. Yes, she said firmly. Harm. Dave leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft breath as he looked around the room. You know what's fascinating? He said. The audience waited. Everybody talks about the harm of jokes, Dave continued. But nobody talks about the harm of shutting people up. A ripple of murmurs spread through the studio. Whoopi rested her chin lightly on her hand. So you believe criticism is the same as censorship? Dave shook his head. No, he replied calmly. Criticism is fine. He paused. But what's happening now isn't just criticism. The audience grew quiet again. One of the co-hosts frowned slightly. What do you mean? Dave's voice stayed calm, but the edge was clearer now. I mean, people aren't just saying they disagree, he said. They're saying certain conversations shouldn't even exist. A few audience members clapped softly. Others remained silent. Whoopi watched him carefully. Dave, she said, some would argue those conversations hurt people who already face discrimination. Dave nodded thoughtfully. I understand that argument, he said. Then he leaned forward again. But I think something else is happening too. The room leaned closer. What's that? Whoopi asked. Dave gestured around the studio. Fear, he said simply. A few audience members whispered to each other. Fear of what? Another co-host asked. Dave smiled faintly. Fear of being laughed at, he said. The audience reacted instantly, some laughter, some gasps. But Dave continued before the moment could settle. Humor has always challenged people, he said. Kings, politicians, celebrities, nobody was safe. He paused. But suddenly comedians are the ones being told what they can and can't say. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. You say that like it's a new thing. Dave chuckled. It is, he replied. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping slightly. Because it used to be the audience that decided if a joke worked. The audience clapped again. But now, Dave added, it's headlines. The co-host beside Whoopi crossed her arms. Or maybe, she said, it's people speaking up for themselves. Dave nodded respectfully. And they should, he said. But speaking up shouldn't mean nobody else is allowed to speak. That line sent another ripple through the crowd. Some applauded loudly. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Whoopi tapped the table lightly. You know what I hear you saying? She said slowly. Dave looked at her. What? That comedians should be able to say anything without consequences. Dave shook his head immediately. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? She asked. Dave paused. For a moment, the playful energy left his face entirely. I'm saying comedians should be able to say something without being treated like enemies. The audience went quiet again. That line landed heavier than the jokes before it. One of the co-hosts leaned in again. But Dave, some of your critics say you're punching down. Dave looked at her calmly. Punching down, he repeated. Yes, she said. Dave smiled slightly. You know, that phrase didn't even exist when I started doing comedy. The audience laughed softly. But seriously, Dave continued, who decides which direction is down? The co-host hesitated. Well, society does. Dave raised his eyebrows. Society. He gestured toward the audience. Because last time I checked, society disagrees with itself every 5 minutes. Laughter broke out across the studio. Even a few audience members who had looked uncomfortable earlier couldn't help smiling. Whoopi tried to hide a small grin. You're good at this, she admitted. Dave shrugged. It's my profession. But Whoopi leaned forward again, her tone becoming more serious. Dave, this conversation isn't just about comedy, she said. Dave's eyes narrowed slightly. Then what is it about? Whoopi didn't hesitate. It's about influence. The room quieted instantly. You're one of the most famous comedians in the world, she continued. When you say something on stage, millions of people hear it. Dave nodded slowly. I know. And that means your words carry weight, she said. Dave leaned back again. All words carry weight. But some carry more, Whoopi replied. Dave paused. Then he said something that made the entire studio fall silent. You know who carries the most weight? He asked. Whoopi looked curious. Who? Dave pointed gently toward the panel. The people who decide which voices get heard, and which ones get labeled dangerous. The audience gasped. A wave of whispers swept through the room. Even the co-hosts looked slightly stunned by the comment. Whoopi sat very still. For a moment, it looked like she might push back immediately. But instead, she studied Dave carefully. You think that's what we're doing here? She asked quietly. Dave didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile either. I think conversations about speech should include the people speaking. The room stayed silent. For a split second, even the producers seemed unsure whether to cut to a commercial break. Then one of the co-hosts broke the tension. Dave, she said cautiously, are you saying shows like this are trying to silence you? Dave exhaled slowly. No. Then he leaned forward again. I'm saying something more complicated than that. The audience leaned in again. Which is? Whoopi asked. Dave looked directly at her. We're living in a moment, he said, where everybody wants to control the conversation. He paused. But the truth is, his voice dropped just enough to make the audience strain to hear the next words. Once you start controlling conversations, the studio grew completely silent. You stop learning anything from them. That line hit the room like thunder. For the first time since the interview began, the panel didn't immediately respond. Whoopi leaned back slowly in her chair. The tension had reached a level that daytime television rarely sees. But the moment that followed would push the conversation even further. Because Whoopi suddenly asked a question that would force Dave Chappelle to confront something far more personal than jokes or headlines. And when he answered it, the entire room would realize this interview had just crossed a line no one expected. The silence after Dave's last words felt heavier than anything that had been said before. Inside the bright studio of The View, the audience shifted in their seats, sensing that the conversation had moved far beyond jokes and headlines. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, studying Dave Chappelle carefully. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. And that silence said almost as much as the words. Dave's statement still lingered in the air. Once you start controlling conversations, you stop learning anything from them. Some audience members had clapped. Others looked uncertain. Now everyone was waiting to see how Whoopi would respond. She finally leaned forward again, resting her hands on the table. Dave, she said calmly, let me ask you something directly. Dave nodded. Go ahead. Her voice was steady, but the seriousness in it was unmistakable. Do you believe the criticism you've received is unfair, or do you believe people simply misunderstood your intent? The question hung in the air. Dave paused before answering. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Well, he said slowly, I think both things can be true at the same time. The audience leaned closer. Meaning? One of the co-hosts asked. Dave folded his hands together. Meaning sometimes people misunderstand jokes, he said. And sometimes people decide they want to misunderstand them. A few audience members laughed quietly, but the panel remained serious. Whoopi tilted her head slightly. So you believe some people are intentionally misrepresenting what you say? Dave shrugged. I think some people benefit from outrage. The room murmured again. One co-host jumped in quickly. That sounds like you're dismissing real concerns. Dave turned toward her calmly. No, he said. I'm saying outrage has become an industry. The audience reacted instantly, some clapping, some whispering to each other. Dave continued. Think about it, he said. One joke gets clipped, shared online, and suddenly millions of people who weren't even there are debating it. Whoopi nodded slightly. That's the world we live in now. Dave smiled faintly. Exactly. Then he leaned forward. But the internet doesn't care about context. The audience murmured again. It cares about reactions, Dave added. A co-host crossed her arms. Are you saying the criticism is fake? Dave shook his head. No. He paused. But the amplification is very real. The audience went quiet again. Dave continued speaking more slowly now, as if explaining something deeper than just comedy. When I perform stand-up, he said, I'm talking to the people in that room. He gestured toward the audience. People who came there to laugh, think, and sometimes even feel uncomfortable. Whoopi nodded. That's part of comedy. Dave continued. But when a clip travels across the internet without context, he spread his hands slightly. Suddenly the conversation changes. The audience listened closely. It stops being about the joke, Dave said. What does it become? Whoopi asked. Dave looked directly at her. It becomes about controlling the narrative. The tension returned immediately. The co-host beside Whoopi shook her head. That sounds like a conspiracy. Dave chuckled. It's not a conspiracy, he said. It's human nature. The audience laughed softly. People want their version of the story to win, Dave added. Whoopi leaned forward again. But Dave, let's talk about something else. Dave looked curious. Okay. Whoopi's voice became slightly more personal. You've walked away from fame before. The audience reacted instantly. Everyone knew what she was referring to. Years earlier, Dave Chappelle had shocked the entertainment world by stepping away from massive success. Walking away from millions of dollars and one of the biggest comedy shows in television. You left everything behind once, Whoopi continued. Why? Dave smiled softly. That's a long story. We've got time, Whoopi replied. The audience laughed. Dave leaned back in his chair. You know, he said, people always assume I walked away because of money or pressure. He shook his head. But that's not the truth. The studio grew quiet again. The truth is, Dave said, I walked away because something didn't feel right. Whoopi listened carefully. What didn't feel right? Dave looked around the room. Then he said something that immediately grabbed everyone's attention. I started noticing the way people were laughing. The audience looked confused. What do you mean? One co-host asked. Dave's tone became serious. There's a difference between laughing with someone and laughing at someone. The room went completely silent. Dave continued. And one day, he said, I realized some people weren't laughing the way I thought they were. Whoopi nodded slowly. That must have been difficult. Dave shrugged. It was eye-opening. Then he added something that made the audience gasp. Because I realized something important about comedy. The entire room leaned forward again. What's that? Whoopi asked. Dave's voice dropped slightly. Comedy reveals the truth about people. The audience stayed silent. When people laugh, Dave continued, you learn what they really think. Whoopi studied him carefully. And what did you learn? Dave paused. Then he said quietly, I learned that sometimes the audience isn't laughing for the reason you hoped. The tension in the room deepened. One of the co-hosts leaned forward. So you're saying audiences can misunderstand comedy too? Dave nodded. Of course. Then he smiled slightly. But misunderstanding works both ways. The audience murmured again. What do you mean? Whoopi asked. Dave leaned forward again, his voice steady. I mean, sometimes the audience misunderstands the comedian. He paused. And sometimes the world misunderstands the audience. The room fell silent once more. Even the panel seemed unsure how to respond. Whoopi finally broke the silence. Dave, she said slowly, do you regret any of the jokes that caused this controversy? The audience froze. It was the most direct question of the entire interview. Dave didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the crowd. Then back at the panel. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the words carried weight. Regret is a complicated thing. The audience leaned closer. Because if you regret telling the truth. He paused. You start lying to keep people comfortable. The room exploded with reactions. Some people clapped loudly. Others gasped. But Dave hadn't finished. And comedians who start lying. He leaned forward one more time. Stop being comedians. The tension in the studio had reached its peak. But the most shocking moment of the interview was still coming. Because Whoopi Goldberg was about to respond in a way that would completely change the energy of the room. And what happened next would turn this interview into one of the most talked about moments in the history of daytime television. For a moment after Dave's words landed, the entire studio felt frozen. The bright lights of The View still shone across the stage, but the atmosphere had shifted into something far more intense than daytime television usually allowed. And comedians who start lying stop being comedians. The audience reacted in waves. Some clapped loudly. Others gasped. A few people simply stared at the table, unsure how the conversation would continue. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg sat very still. Her expression wasn't angry. It was thoughtful, careful, like someone choosing their next words with extreme precision. Finally, she leaned forward. Dave, she said slowly, you talk a lot about truth. Dave Chappelle nodded. That's the job. But truth, Whoopi continued, isn't always the same thing as perspective. The audience quieted again. Dave rested his hands lightly on the table. That's fair, he said. But comedy has always been about perspective. Whoopi nodded slightly. Yes, but sometimes that perspective comes from a place of privilege. A murmur spread through the crowd. Dave raised an eyebrow. Privilege. One of the co-hosts leaned in quickly. Dave, you're incredibly successful. Famous. Wealthy. Influential. She gestured toward him. That position gives you power. Dave chuckled softly. You know what's funny about that word? What? She asked. Power. The audience leaned closer. Dave spread his hands slightly. People keep saying comedians have power, he said. But last time I checked, comedians are just people with microphones. Some audience members laughed. But Whoopi didn't smile. A microphone is power, she replied. Dave nodded slowly. Then so is a television studio. The audience gasped again. The tension was back. Thick. Electric. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone stayed calm. So what you're saying is, the media has more power than comedians. Dave didn't hesitate. I'm saying the media decides which voices get amplified, and which ones get labeled dangerous. The crowd erupted. Applause mixed with shocked whispers. Even the co-hosts exchanged quick glances. Whoopi held up a hand, calming the room slightly. Dave, she said, this show exists so people can have conversations. Dave nodded. And I appreciate that. Then he leaned forward again. But conversations only work when nobody's afraid to speak. That line drew another wave of applause. The tension between Dave and the panel had become the central energy of the entire studio. But something unexpected happened next. Whoopi smiled. Not sarcastically. Not defensively. Just a small, knowing smile. You know something, Dave? What's that? He asked. You're not wrong about everything. The audience reacted with surprised laughter. Dave laughed too. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. The room relaxed slightly. But Whoopi continued. Comedy is important, she said. It pushes boundaries. Dave nodded. But boundaries exist for a reason. The audience listened carefully. And sometimes, she added, those boundaries remind us to think about how our words affect others. Dave didn't interrupt. For the first time in the interview, he simply listened. Then he spoke quietly. And sometimes boundaries remind us who's afraid of certain conversations. The audience murmured again. But the tone had changed. It was no longer just confrontation. It was something deeper. A clash of perspectives. Whoopi leaned back in her chair. You know what I think, she said. Dave looked curious. What? I think the real reason people argue about comedy, she paused, is because comedy forces society to look at itself. The audience clapped. Dave nodded slowly. That's true. But when people see themselves in a joke, Whoopi continued, they don't always like what they see. Dave smiled faintly. That's when the joke is working. The audience erupted into laughter and applause. Even some of the co-hosts laughed. For a moment, the tension eased completely. But the impact of the conversation had already taken root. Behind the cameras, producers were already whispering. They knew something unusual had happened. Something people would be talking about long after the broadcast ended. And they were right, because within hours of the interview airing, clips of the exchange between Dave Chappelle and Whoopi Goldberg began spreading across the internet. Debates exploded online. Some viewers praised Dave for defending comedy and free expression. Others criticized his comments, arguing that comedians should be more mindful of the impact their words can have. News outlets picked up the story. Opinion columns appeared almost immediately. Social media turned the conversation into a battleground of ideas. One side argued that comedy must remain fearless. The other insisted that influence carries responsibility. And right at the center of the storm were two people sitting across a talk show table. Dave Chappelle, Whoopi Goldberg. Neither of them had shouted. Neither had insulted the other. But the intensity of their words had sparked a national conversation. Days later, commentators would still be replaying the moment when Dave said, "Once you start controlling conversations, you stop learning anything from them." And others would point to Whoopi's reminder that influence comes with responsibility. The truth was, both perspectives resonated with different people. And that was exactly what made the moment so powerful. Because sometimes the most important conversations aren't the ones where someone wins. They're the ones where nobody backs down. And everyone listening is forced to think. The audience inside the studio gave one final round of applause as the show prepared to cut to commercial. Dave stood up from the table. Whoopi stood as well. For a brief second, they looked at each other. Then they shook hands. Not as enemies, but as two people who had just shared a very real conversation. The cameras faded, but the debate had only just begun. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think comedians should have complete freedom to joke about anything? Or do you believe public figures must be more careful with their words? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic stories about shocking celebrity moments and powerful confrontations like this one, make sure you subscribe to the Truth Narrator, like this video, and share it with someone who loves intense, thought-provoking stories. Because the next story might be even more explosive.